The morning Clark Graves lowered his father into the red Oklahoma earth, he made a silent promise to himself that he would never again let another living soul close enough to hurt him. That was 3 years ago, and he had kept that promise with the discipline of a man who believed the world owed him exactly nothing. His ranch sat 9 miles east of Cimarron, New Mexico Territory, in the year 1882, a spread of land that his father, Thomas Graves, had built from raw prairie into something that resembled a real working cattle operation. There were 400 acres of sparse grass and canyon scrub, a sturdy two-room cabin with a stone fireplace, a barn that leaned slightly to the northwest, and a bunkhouse where two hired hands, Denny Prout and old Hector Vasquez, slept and complained about the wind. Clark ran the whole operation himself in spirit, even if Denny and Hector did the bulk of the heavy lifting on the days when Clark's mood descended like a thunderhead and made him useless for anything requiring patience. He was 28 years old, broad in the shoulders, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar because he never bothered to get it cut in town, and a jaw that seemed carved from the same red rock that defined the landscape around him. His eyes were a shade of gray that people tended to describe as winter sky, or sometimes just as cold. He was not a cruel man. He was very clear with himself about that distinction. He paid Denny and Hector fair wages. He kept his fences mended so his cattle did not stray onto the Peralta family's land to the south, and he had once pulled a coyote-bitten calf from the arroyo at 3 in the morning without cursing the animal once. He was not cruel. He was simply sealed, the way a jar is sealed, tight enough that nothing could get in and nothing could get out. His father had been the last person to reach him, and Thomas Graves had done it not through any particular softness, but through the sheer stubborn repetition of showing up. Every morning of Clark's childhood and young manhood, Thomas had been at the breakfast table with 2 cups of coffee poured before Clark even came through the door. Every evening at sundown, Thomas had walked the fence line and expected Clark to walk it with him, and those walks had been full of the kind of quiet conversation that teaches a person what it means to be accountable to a piece of land and to the people who live on it. When Thomas died of a fast and merciless pneumonia in the November of 1879, Clark had stood at that grave and felt something leave him that he could not name and could not retrieve. It was not grief exactly, though grief was certainly present. It was something more fundamental. It was the last warm thing he had believed in, dropping into the cold ground with his father's pine box, and he had covered it over with the same dirt he used to cover everything else. The cattle business in the New Mexico Territory in 1882 was not simple. The Lincoln County War had burned itself out a few years prior, but it had left behind a landscape of men who had learned violence and had not yet learned anything to replace it. Rustling was common. Water rights disputes could turn into shooting disputes with uncomfortable speed. Clark had navigated all of it with the particular efficiency of a man who had nothing to lose, which made him, paradoxically, quite good at appearing dangerous without being especially reckless. He had a reputation in Cimarron as a man you did not ask twice for anything. The first time you asked, Clark Graves would consider your request with those winter sky eyes and either help you or he would not. If he helped you completely and without complaint. If he declined, he had already made up his mind and no amount of pleading or logic would move him. The townspeople had calibrated their relationship with him accordingly. They respected him. They did not particularly like him. And they had long since stopped trying to draw him into anything resembling social warmth. Then came the middle of September, with the first edge of autumn just beginning to thin the heat, and everything changed. It started with a wagon that was not supposed to be on the road in front of Clark's ranch at all. He heard it before he saw it, the uneven groan of a wheel that had taken some kind of damage, the laboring sound of a horse pushed past its comfortable endurance. Clark was in the yard splitting wood when the sound reached him. He kept splitting for a moment, because sounds were not his responsibility, and then the horse made a different sound, one that was unmistakably distressed, and Clark set down his axe because the distress of an animal was something he could not ignore even when he tried. The wagon came into view around the curve of the road that skirted his front fence line, and it was immediately apparent that something had gone significantly wrong. The left rear wheel was cracked through the hub, and the whole wagon listed hard to that side. The horse, a bay mare with the hollow look of an animal that had been traveling too long on too little water, had stopped moving entirely and was blowing hard through her nostrils, head hanging low. And on the seat of that ruined wagon sat a woman. She was young, perhaps 24 or 25, and she had the particular posture of someone who had decided not to show how frightened she was but had not entirely succeeded. Her dark hair was coming loose from its pins, and her dress, which had clearly been good quality once, was now the color of the territory's red dust. She held the reins in both hands even though the horse had stopped, as if the act of holding them gave her something to hold onto. Clark walked to the fence and looked at the wagon and then at her. She looked back at him with eyes that were a warm, steady brown, and she said, "I realize this is not an ideal introduction. My name is Emma Turner. My wheel is broken and my horse is exhausted and I believe I am lost." Clark looked at the wheel. He looked at the horse. He looked back at Emma Turner with those winter sky eyes. "You are lost," he confirmed. "I was trying to reach a place called Cimarron," she said, and her voice was steady, which he noticed. "I was told it was straightforward from the junction at the creek." "That junction is 6 miles back that way," Clark said, pointing. "You went the wrong direction at the fork." Emma Turner absorbed this information with a small closed breath and then nodded once very precisely. "I see. Well, could you tell me how far I am from town?" 9 miles the way you'd have to go now since you can't go back through the ford with that wheel." He looked at the wheel again. "You're not going 9 miles on that wheel. You're not going 9 yards. There was a pause. The horse shifted its weight unhappily. "Would you happen to know of somewhere nearby where I might make repairs?" Emma asked. Clark was aware of himself in that moment in the particular way that happens when a person stands at the edge of a choice. He could tell her to wait while he rode to get someone from town, or he could simply offer what was obvious, which was that his ranch was directly behind him, that he had a spare wheel hub in the barn, and that the well in his yard held water that the mare needed immediately. He could feel the old habitual refusal beginning to form in his chest, the protective mechanism that kept the world at arm's length. He thought of his father, not deliberately. Thomas Graves simply appeared in his mind the way he sometimes did, standing at the breakfast table with 2 cups of coffee, unremarkable and permanent. "Pull the wagon through the gate," Clark said. "The horse needs water." Something in Emma Turner's face shifted, not quite relief but adjacent to it. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it in a way that was not effusive or desperate but simply genuine. He opened the gate himself, and she guided the limping wagon through. Emma Turner had come to the New Mexico Territory from Independence, Missouri, and she had come because there was nothing left for her in Independence. This was not a dramatic story. She told him later that evening while he worked on the wheel, and she sat on an upturned crate and occasionally handed him tools when he asked for them. Her parents had both died within a year of each other, her mother of a fever, her father of a broken heart that everyone agreed had been real even if it was not medically precise. She had a brother in Cimarron who had written to her twice urging her to come, saying there was work and possibility in the territory for a woman who could keep books and manage a household. And the last of her Independence connections had been a rented room that cost more than she could earn mending and teaching piano. "So you packed everything you owned into a wagon," Clark said, without looking up from the wheel hub. "3 trunks and a crate of my father's books," Emma said, "and a guitar, though I am not very good at it." "Where did you learn to keep books?" "My father taught me. He ran a dry goods store. He believed women should understand numbers the same as men." She paused. "I think he was right, though it did not make me very popular in certain social circles." Clark fitted a piece into place and reached for a wrench. "What kind of work does your brother have in mind?" "He runs a general store." He says he needs someone to manage the accounts and the ordering because he is a fine merchant but a terrible bookkeeper. She watched Clark's hands for a moment. You're very good at this. Wheels break out here, he said simply. There was a comfortable silence. Outside, the last of the day's light was turning the sky over the canyon rim into layers of orange and violet. Denny Prout appeared in the barn doorway, took in the situation with the practiced neutrality of a hired hand who understood his employer's moods, said he would put the mare in the spare stall and see to her feed, and disappeared before anyone had to explain anything. I am sorry to impose, Emma said. You're not imposing, Clark said, and then seemed slightly surprised to have said it. She studied him the way a perceptive person studies a landscape, taking in the whole of it before cataloging the details. What she saw was a man who moved with a kind of self-contained competence that she recognized from her father, that quality of a person who has had to rely on themselves for so long that reliance has become its own form of pride. She also saw, and this was harder to articulate, something that looked like a door that had not been opened in a very long time, not locked perhaps, but very firmly shut. You live here alone, she asked. 2 hired hands, but no family. He did not answer immediately. He tightened a bolt with more attention than the bolt strictly required. My father died 3 years ago, he said. Before that we ran this place together. I'm sorry. It was pneumonia, it was fast. Fast is not necessarily easier, Emma said quietly. Clark looked at her then fully, and she held the look without flinching. He turned back to the wheel, but something in his posture had shifted marginally, the way a door shifts when someone approaches it. You'll need to stay the night, he said. I can have that wheel ready by morning, but I'm not sending you down that road in the dark. I don't want to put you out. You're not, he said, for the second time that evening. Hector Vasquez, who was 60 years old and had been born in Santa Fe, and had seen more of the territory than most men twice his age, made a supper of beans and cornbread and beef stew that was considerably better than it had any right to be given the ingredients. He served it without ceremony at the table in the cabin's main room, and then took his own plate to the bunkhouse, with the diplomatic instinct of a man who understood that certain situations required space. Clark and Emma ate together at that table, and it was the first time in 3 years that Clark had eaten supper with another person, and he found, somewhat against his will, that it was not unpleasant. She did not try to fill every silence, which he appreciated. She asked him about the land, how many head of cattle, what the winters were like, whether the canyon to the east flooded in the spring. She listened to his answers with the focused attention of someone who was actually interested, not simply performing interest. He asked about her brother. His name was James Turner, and he had come out to the territory 4 years ago with the second wave of settlement that followed the railroad's push west. He had done reasonably well, Clark admitted, because he'd heard of the Turner Mercantile on Main Street in Cimarron. He had purchased supplies there twice and found it a well-stocked establishment. That sounds like James, Emma said, with a warmth that was clearly specific to her brother, not just a general social warmth. He puts tremendous effort into everything. He just cannot subtract. Clark found himself close to smiling at this. He did not quite smile, but it was nearer than he had been to smiling in a considerable time. After supper, he showed her the small storeroom off the main room, which had a cot and a window, and which he used for storing things that he could very easily store in the barn. He did not say any of this. He simply showed her the room, and she accepted it with the same undemanding gratitude with which she accepted everything he offered. "Good night, Mr. Graves," she said at the door. "Clark," he said, not sure why. "Good night, Clark," she said. He lay awake for an hour that night, listening to the coyotes in the canyon and the occasional sound of the mare shifting in her stall, and trying to identify the strange sensation in his chest that he had not felt in 3 years. It was not discomfort exactly. It was something more like the feeling of a fire in a cold hearth, the first tentative warmth before you were sure the wood would catch. He dismissed it. He was a practical man. He would fix the wheel and she would go to her brother, and that would be the end of it. He fixed the wheel. She left in the morning after breakfast. Hector made eggs and biscuits, and again disappeared with diplomatic precision. And Clark hitched the mare himself and checked the other wheel fastenings while he was at it, and added water to the wagon's barrel without being asked. Emma stood in the yard while he worked, and she watched the canyon rim where the early light was just beginning to define the rock formations. "It's beautiful here," she said. "I didn't expect it to be beautiful. Most people don't." She turned to look at him. "Will you come to Cimarron sometimes?" The question was entirely practical. She asked it the way you ask a neighbor whether they come to town, with no particular loaded meaning, and with the candid directness that he was beginning to recognize as simply her manner of being in the world. "I come for supplies," he said, "every 3 weeks or so." "Then perhaps I'll see you at James's store," she said. "I would like that." Clark handed her the reins and stepped back. "Be careful at the ford," he said. "Take it slow. The water's down this time of year, but the rocks are slick." "I will." She looked at him from the wagon seat with those steady brown eyes. "Thank you, Clark, truly." He watched the wagon until it disappeared around the curve of the road. Then he stood in his yard for a moment, alone as he always was, and felt the unfamiliar warmth in his chest doing what it had done the night before, which was refusing to be dismissed. He went inside and poured himself a cup of coffee. He thought about her eyes. He went outside again and split wood until the feeling became manageable. He came to Cimarron 10 days later, which was sooner than his usual 3-week cycle, and which he explained to himself privately by the fact that he was running low on lamp oil. This was technically true. The lamp oil situation was not urgent. He came anyway. Turner Mercantile on Main Street was a neat establishment with a painted sign and a porch that someone had recently swept. Inside, the shelves were well organized and the stock was varied, and James Turner himself was behind the counter, discussing the merits of various flour grades with a rancher's wife when Clark came through the door. James was 28, a year younger than Emma, with the same dark hair and a friendly open face that made it immediately clear he was not the reserved one of the Turner siblings. He looked up, recognized Clark, and began the ordinary transaction. Then Emma came through the doorway at the back of the store, carrying a ledger book and wearing an expression of focused concentration that dissolved into a smile when she saw who was at the counter. "Clark," she said, with a warmth that was specific and genuine. "Miss Turner," he said. "Emma," she corrected, exactly as he had corrected her. James Turner's eyes moved between them with the silent, cheerful acuity of an older, or rather, a younger sibling who has learned to read certain situations quickly. He said nothing, which suggested a degree of social intelligence that he perhaps had not put on obvious display up until now. Clark bought his lamp oil. He also bought some coffee and a bolt of canvas and a box of horseshoe nails, all of which he needed, and he was preparing to leave when Emma appeared at his elbow and said, "Do you have time for a walk? I have been sitting with that ledger all morning, and I would very much like to see some of this town I have only been in for 10 days. He did have time. He had allocated an entire day to this trip to town, mostly because Denny and Hector could manage the ranch for a day without him, and there was nothing he needed to do at home that could not wait. He had not admitted to himself until this moment that the extra time had been deliberately left open, but he was confronting it now. "I have time," he said. Cimarron in 1882 was a town that had come up fast and was not yet entirely sure of itself. There was a hotel, a post office, a land office, 3 saloons, 2 churches, a school, a doctor's office, the mercantile, a livery, a blacksmith, and a scattering of homes that ranged from fine to barely standing. The surrounding territory was spectacular, with the canyon and the mountains framing everything, and the sky above it was the particular blue that only exists in high, dry air. They walked along the main street and then down a quieter side street where someone had planted cottonwood saplings along a ditch bank. Emma talked about the town as she was discovering it, What surprised her? What matched her expectations? She had met the postmaster's wife, who was formidable. She had found the school, which needed a better reader library. She had not yet found anyone who could properly repair a saddle, though she did not own a horse yet and was not sure she needed one. "You should have one," Clark said. "Out here, a horse is necessary. Can you buy a trustworthy one in town? Delgado at the livery has 3 that are worth considering. Tell him I sent you." Emma looked at him sideways, and there was something in her look that was pleased and warm in a way that made Clark simultaneously want to lean toward it and step back from it. He was very conscious of the tension between those two impulses. "You have influence at the livery?" she asked. "I have a reputation for knowing horses," he said. "Delgado respects that." "Is that all you have a reputation for?" He considered this. "People say I'm difficult." Emma nodded slowly, as if this aligned with something she had already observed but found less alarming than advertised. "I think people sometimes call men difficult when they mean private," she said. Clark looked at her. "My father was the same way," she continued. "Everyone in town thought he was stern. He was not stern. He was simply not interested in telling people things that were none of their business." "That's an accurate description," Clark said, and it was the longest thing he had volunteered about himself in some time. They reached the end of the cottonwood-lined street and stood looking at the mountains to the west, which were beginning to show the faint smear of early-season snow on their highest peaks. The light was perfect. Clark was aware of Emma standing beside him, close enough that he could have reached out and taken her hand if he had been a different man, or if he had been 3 years less sealed than he was. He did not reach out, but he noticed that he wanted to. They walked back to the mercantile, and he loaded his supplies onto his horse, and she stood on the porch and said goodbye the way she did everything else, directly, warmly, without performance. "Will you come back soon?" she asked. 2 weeks, he said. "Maybe sooner if I need something," she smiled. "I hope you need something." He rode home and spent the entire 9 miles arguing with himself about whether he was being foolish. Over the following weeks, a pattern established itself with the quiet inevitability of water finding its level. Clark came to town with increasing frequency, twice in 2 weeks, then weekly, and each time the official reason was legitimate enough to satisfy the part of him that required logic. And each time he and Emma walked or talked or sat together in the mercantile when it was quiet, and each time he returned to his ranch carrying something new. Not objects, or not only objects. He carried her observations, the specific way she described the sunset over the canyon as looking like God had spilled something wonderful. He carried her laugh, which was quiet and genuine and came without warning. He carried small pieces of what she believed about fairness, about work, about what people owed each other and what they did not. He was not a man who made easy admissions, even to himself, so he did not immediately call what was happening by its proper name. He told himself he was simply forming a neighborly acquaintance with a woman who had needed assistance, and whose family ran a business he patronized. This explanation lasted approximately 3 weeks before it became untenable. What happened at the end of those 3 weeks was this. He arrived in Cimarron on a Wednesday to find Emma in the middle of a difficult situation. A man named Burris Holt, who owned a freighting operation out of Springer, and who had the particular confidence of a man accustomed to women doing as he suggested, had come into the mercantile to settle an account, and had taken Emma's correction of his arithmetic as an insult requiring prolonged argument. He was not shouting. He was doing something more insidious, which was speaking to her with a slow, dismissive patience that treated her competence as a curiosity to be humored. Clark came through the door in the middle of it. He read the situation with the speed of a man who has navigated enough conflict to understand it at a glance. Emma's spine was very straight, and her hands were flat on the counter, and she was not afraid. But she was tired in the way of a person who has had to make the same argument too many times. Clark stepped up beside her, not in front of her, which would have been condescending, beside her. He looked at Burris Holt with those winter sky eyes and said, very quietly, "Miss Turner is correct. I've done business with her father's books for a month now, and her arithmetic is faultless." Burris Holt looked at Clark. He knew who Clark Graves was. Most people in the territory did. There was a brief recalibration of priorities, and Burris Holt paid his account according to Emma's figures and left without further commentary. Emma looked at Clark. There was something in her expression that he could not entirely catalog: gratitude, yes, but more than gratitude. Something that recognized the specific way in which he had helped her, next to her rather than in front of her. "Thank you," she said. "He was wrong," Clark said simply. James Turner appeared from the back of the store, took in the situation, and said, "You'll stay for supper, Clark. I insist." It was the first time Clark had eaten at someone else's table since his father's death. James Turner was good company in the effortless way of some people who simply like other people and find them interesting without requiring them to perform. He asked Clark about the ranch in a way that was genuinely curious, not just conversational filler, and he talked about the mercantile and the territory with the enthusiasm of a man who had made a good bet on a new place and was gratified to see it paying out. The three of them sat around the table in the small apartment above the store. Emma had done something to the space in 10 days that made it feel deliberately inhabited, with her father's books on a shelf and a curtain she'd sewn herself at the window, and Clark ate someone else's food and felt the sealed thing in his chest doing something new. It was opening. Not quickly, not easily, not without the particular pain of something that has been closed too long beginning to move again, but opening. After supper, James found an errand that took him downstairs, and Clark and Emma sat on the small balcony that looked over the main street and the mountains beyond. The evening was cool, and she had brought out a blanket for her shoulders, and the oil lamp inside threw a warm light through the window. "Can I ask you something directly?" Emma said. "You could try," she smiled at that. "You came to town much sooner than 3 weeks. I needed things." Clark, her tone was gentle but precise. He looked at the mountains. "Yes," he said, "I came sooner than I needed to." "I'm glad," she said. "I would have been disappointed if you hadn't." The words landed in the quiet between them and settled. Clark was quiet for a long moment, and she did not rush him, which he was beginning to understand was one of her particular qualities. She understood that some people required space to arrive at things. "I should tell you something," he said. "All right. I'm not easy company. You've probably gathered that. I kept to myself after my father died. I don't do well with people the way some men do." "I hadn't noticed you being difficult," Emma said. "I've found you to be quite straightforward, actually." "That's not the same thing as easy." "No," she agreed, "but I don't particularly want easy. I want honest, and you are honest." Clark turned and looked at her then, fully and without the sideways caution he usually employed. She was looking back at him with those brown eyes, warm and steady, and the lamplight was in her hair, and the mountains were behind her, and the whole evening seemed to hold its breath. "I don't know what I'm doing," he said. "I think you do," she said softly. "Emma." Her name in his voice was new, and they both heard it. "Yes," she said, and her voice was soft. "I would like to call on you properly," he said. "If that's acceptable to you and to James." Emma's smile, when it came, was the kind that changes a person's face entirely, not just the mouth but the eyes, the whole quality of the expression. "I believe James would be very pleased," she said, "and I would be as well." He left that night feeling like a man who had stepped off a cliff and discovered, midway down, that there was solid ground where there should not have been. James Turner gave his permission for Clark's courtship with an enthusiasm that bordered on relief. "I was beginning to think I'd have to find some way to contrive you spending more time together," James told Clark the following Sunday, when Clark arrived for the first official Sunday dinner. "You were both very careful about it." "I'm not a careful man generally," Clark said, handing James a bottle of decent whiskey he'd acquired in town. "No," James agreed, studying him. "I think with my sister you were careful because you actually cared what happened. That's different from being a careful man." Clark sat with that observation for the rest of the day. Autumn deepened, and the courtship deepened with it. Clark came to town on Sundays, and Emma came to the ranch once, with James as a chaperone who managed to be present and simultaneously invisible. And she walked the fence line with Clark, the way Thomas Graves had walked it with his son. And Clark found himself talking about his father without the usual heavy door slamming shut in his chest. He talked about those evening walks and the 2 cups of coffee poured before he woke, and the way Thomas had known the name of every creek and rock formation within 30 miles. "He sounds like a man worth knowing," Emma said. "He was the best man I ever knew," Clark said simply. "I think he would have been glad to know you found someone to walk this fence line with you," she said. Clark looked at her. "I'm not trying to make you sad," she said quickly. "You didn't," he said. "You made me think of something I hadn't thought of before." She waited. "He used to say the land only means something if you share it," Clark said. "I thought he meant shared ownership or shared labor. I think maybe he meant something else." Emma was quiet for a moment. The late afternoon light was long and golden over the grassland, and the cattle were moving slowly toward the water trough, and the whole ranch had the look of a place that was working the way it was supposed to work. "I think he was probably a wise man," she said. "He was," a pause. "I buried more than him when he died. I think I buried the part of me that he'd kept alive, the part that reached toward things." Emma stopped walking. He stopped too and looked at her, and she was looking at him with an expression that was wholly serious and wholly warm at the same time. "Is it still buried?" she asked. He thought about the past 2 months. He thought about lamp oil and Sunday dinners and walking fence lines and the peculiar relief of saying her name. He thought about how she handed him tools and did not chatter and asked real questions and looked at him like he was worth looking at. "No," he said. "Not anymore. I don't think it is." She reached out and took his hand briefly, just a touch, her fingers on his knuckles, warm and certain, and then released it. But the warmth stayed. The trouble came in November because trouble in the territory rarely took the season off. A man named Royce Prout, no relation to Clark's hired hand Denny, arrived in Cimarron with a claim that the eastern 40 acres of Clark's ranch had been improperly registered, and that he had a prior land claim that superseded Clark's deed. It was the kind of dispute that the territory generated regularly, partly because the land records were inconsistent, and partly because there were men who made their livelihood from exactly this type of manufactured confusion. Clark had seen Royce Prout's type before. He came into town with legal papers that looked authoritative, with a surveyor he'd brought from Santa Fe, and with the polished manner of a man who had done this several times and found that most ranchers, when confronted with official-looking paperwork and an implied threat of extended legal battle, would rather settle than fight. Clark was not most ranchers. He also, as it happened, had Thomas Graves's meticulous habit of keeping every document, every letter, and every transaction record from the day the ranch was established. Thomas had kept them in a tin box under the floorboard of the cabin, not because he expected trouble, but because he believed a man should be able to account for what was his. Clark went home and opened the tin box. He brought the documents to Emma the next morning and laid them on the counter of the mercantile without preamble. "I need you to look at these," he said. "Tell me if the land register matches the deed." Emma opened the documents without any fuss and began to read, and what followed was 2 hours of her systematic verification of every claim in Royce Prout's papers against Clark's original documentation. She sat at the counter with the concentration of someone doing something she was genuinely skilled at, and Clark sat on a stool across from her and watched her work and felt proud of her in a way that was clean and uncomplicated. "His claim is based on a survey error from 1871, Emma said finally. "But your father's registration was properly recorded in 1873, and the territorial law at the time established clear precedent that a properly recorded deed superseded an unrecorded survey claim regardless of prior date. You need a lawyer, but you have a strong case." "There's a territorial attorney in Cimarron," James said from the back of the store. "Abernathy," Clark said. "He's competent." Then go see Abernathy today, Emma said. Take these documents. Don't let this man surveyor onto your land until there's a court order requiring it, because once he has a surveyed boundary posted, it complicates things even if his claim is invalid. Clark looked at her. How do you know that? My father had a boundary dispute with a neighbor when I was 16, Emma said. I sat through every single meeting with the lawyer. I found it more interesting than anyone else in the family did. Clark gathered the documents. Before he left, he paused at the door. Emma, he said. Yes. I don't know what I would do without you. It was the most he had said in those terms to any living person in 3 years. It came out without planning, and he heard it after he had said it, and he did not take it back. Emma looked at him steadily. You would manage, she said. You always do, but I'm glad you don't have to. He saw Abernathy that afternoon. Abernathy confirmed Emma's analysis with the addition of several legal particulars, and said the case was clear if they could get it in front of the territorial judge who came through Cimarron in December. The claim resolved itself before it reached the judge. Royce Prout's surveyor, when confronted with the strength of Clark's documented case through Abernathy, found an urgent need to be elsewhere, and Prout himself departed Cimarron by the end of November with considerably less confidence than he'd arrived with. Abernathy sent a letter to the Territorial Land Office formally defending Clark's eastern 40 acres, and that was that. What the incident left behind, however, was more significant than its resolution. Clark came to the Mercantile on the first Sunday of December and found Emma arranging the window display for the Christmas season. Someone had shipped glass ornaments to James, on the theory that the territory deserved to know about such things, and she was standing on a step stool putting the last one in place when Clark came through the door, and she looked down at him with paint on her fingers from the little sign she'd been lettering, and her hair coming loose again in the way it always did by mid-afternoon. And something in Clark Graves became entirely and irreversibly clear. He loved her. It was not a tentative or uncertain love. It was the kind of love that arrives fully formed once you have finally let yourself see it, the kind that looks back over the past 2 months and says, yes, it was this. It was always this, from the moment she sat on the wagon seat and said her name without trembling. He reached up and steadied the step stool without being asked, because she was reaching slightly too far to the left, and she thanked him without looking and stepped down and found him right there and looked up. Are you all right? She asked. You look very concentrated. I need to say something, he said. James Turner, who was sorting mail at the back of the store, found an immediate and important need to check inventory in the storeroom. Emma put down the glass ornament she was holding and looked at Clark fully, with all the direct, warm attention that was one of the essential facts of who she was. I am not good at this, Clark said. I want you to know that before I say it, because it will probably not come out the way it should. I don't need it to come out perfectly, she said. He drew a breath. I have been sealed up since my father died. I made up my mind not to want things from people, because wanting things from people means you can lose them, and I had already lost too much. I know you know this. You have known it since that first night in the barn when I was fixing your wheel. I did know it, she said softly, and you came back anyway every Sunday, and you walked the fence line with me, and you sat with those documents for 2 hours and figured out how to protect something that was built by a man you never met because it mattered to me. And he started again. You knocked, Emma. You knocked on something I had decided was closed forever, and I found out it was not. She was very still. I love you, he said. I realize that is something a man is perhaps meant to work up to more slowly, but I am not built for slow when I have finally decided something is true. Emma Turner stood in the window light of the Mercantile with a glass ornament forgotten on the shelf beside her and looked at Clark Graves, and her eyes were brilliant with something that was not sadness, but was close to it in the particular way that joy pressed to its limit becomes almost unbearable. Clark, she said. I know it may be too soon, he said. I know you've been here only a few months. I'm not asking you for anything right now. I'm just telling you the truth because you're the kind of person who deserves the truth, and because I've spent 3 years telling myself lies about what I needed and I'm done with it." She crossed the small distance between them and put her hand against his chest, flat against the front of his coat, and looked up at him. "I love you too," she said. "I have been trying to be patient about it because I could see you needed time to find it, but I have known for quite a while." Clark covered her hand with his. They stood like that for a moment, in the winter light of a territory afternoon, in the middle of a store that smelled of coffee and pine resin, and the particular clean smell of a place that was well kept. And it was not a grand moment in the sense of drama or spectacle, but it was the kind of moment that changes everything quietly and permanently. James Turner reappeared from the storeroom with the expression of a man who had heard every word and was genuinely moved by it, and was trying to look like he had simply been counting flour sacks. "Will you stay for dinner?" he asked Clark. "Yes," Clark said. He was still holding Emma's hand against his chest. James Turner smiled broadly at the tin of baking powder he was holding. "Good," he said. The proposal came 3 weeks later on Christmas Eve, because Clark Graves was not a man who, once he understood something to be true and right, could find any compelling reason to wait for it. He had spoken to James 2 days before, which was the proper thing to do, and James had gripped his hand with both of his and said, "There is no one in the territory I would rather see her with," which was not a qualified endorsement but an absolute one, and which Clark appreciated more than he was able to say. He had ridden into Cimarron that afternoon with a ring that had been his mother's, and which had lived in Thomas Graves's tin box all the years since her death, as if Thomas had known it was waiting for a purpose. It was a simple ring, a small garnet set in gold, and it was beautiful in the way of things that are made with care and meaning rather than with ostentation. Emma was at the Mercantile when he arrived, closing up for the Christmas holiday. The street outside had a dusting of snow, unusual for this part of the territory but not unheard of in December, and the mountain peaks were white against the early evening sky, and someone down the street had hung lanterns along their porch, and the whole town had the particular quality of a place trying to be its best self. Clark came into the store as Emma was turning down the last lamp, and she turned at the sound of the door and saw his face in the low light, and whatever was on his face made her go entirely still. "Clark," she said. He crossed the room to her. He was not nervous in the ordinary sense, he was too settled in his certainty for ordinary nervousness, but he was very aware of the weight of the moment, of how much it meant, of all the years he had spent telling himself that this kind of wanting was something he had given up. He took the ring from his coat pocket. Emma's breath caught very slightly. "I am not a man who finds it easy to hope," he said. "You already know that, but you have made me want to be. You've made me want to build something again, the way my father built this ranch, not because he had to, but because he believed it was worth building." He looked at her steadily. "I want to build something with you, Emma. I want to walk that fence line with you every evening. I want to know that the person sitting across from me at the breakfast table is you. I want a life that is shared the way it is supposed to be shared, and I want it with you and no one else." Emma was looking at him with those warm, steady eyes, and there was something in them now that he had not seen before, which was a kind of radiant certainty, the expression of a person who has found the thing they were moving toward and can see it clearly. "Yes," she said before he could finish the formal question. "Clark, yes." He put the ring on her finger. His hands were steady. Hers were not entirely, but not from doubt. She looked at the ring and then at him, and she reached up and put her hand against his jaw, and he leaned into it. And then he kissed her, slow and certain and full of everything 3 years of sealed silence had kept waiting. When they finally broke apart, both of them breathing a little less evenly than usual, Emma laughed, and the laugh was the quiet, genuine one that he had been carrying in his chest since October, and he thought he would hear it every day for the rest of his life, and it would always feel like this, like something coming home. They were married in February of 1883, on a Saturday that provided a startling blue sky and air cold enough to see your breath, which Emma had decided was beautiful rather than inconvenient. The wedding was held in the small church on 2nd Street, with the Reverend Marsh presiding and James Turner standing up for both of them in the combined role of bride's escort and best man, which he managed with considerable grace. Hector Vasquez and Denny Prout came in their best clothes and sat in the front pew, looking equally uncomfortable and moved. The Mercantile was closed for the day, which Burris Holt, who had returned to Cimarron for freight business and had apparently become a different and less contemptible person since his encounter with Emma's arithmetic later said was a sacrifice of considerable commercial significance, which everyone took as his way of offering congratulations. Emma had worn her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit by a woman in Cimarron named Dolers, who had a gift for such things, and who had taken the job with an emotional investment that Clark found touching and slightly alarming. The dress was cream-colored wool, practical for February and beautiful in the light of the church, and Emma wore her dark hair up with small white flowers that someone had dried and saved from the summer, and she walked down the aisle of that small territorial church looking like the most purposeful person Clark had ever seen, which meant she looked exactly like herself, only with flowers in her hair. He stood at the front of the church and watched her come toward him and felt the strange doubled sensation of a man who is simultaneously receiving the happiest thing that has ever happened to him and understanding, for the first time, the full magnitude of what he had almost forfeited, how close he had come to remaining sealed forever, to letting that promise he'd made at his father's grave become his whole life. She reached him and took his hands, and Reverend Marsh said the words, and Clark said his vows in a voice that was quiet and steady and meant every syllable, and Emma said hers looking straight at him, and when the Reverend declared them married, Clark kissed his wife with considerably more warmth than was strictly traditional, and nobody in the small church felt it was inappropriate. They had a supper at the hotel that James had arranged, and Hector played the guitar. He was, unlike Emma who had claimed not to be, actually very good, and someone produced a fiddle, and the evening had the quality of a celebration that is entirely genuine, with no formal performance to it, just people in a warm room being glad for something real. Clark danced with his wife. He was not, by his own admission, a dancer. But he had decided that the day he married Emma Turner was a day on which he would not refuse himself anything that she wanted, and she wanted to dance, so he danced with her, and she laughed at his expression of focused determination, and he found that her laugh against his shoulder made the whole enterprise feel considerably less like a trial. "You're not as bad as you claimed," she said. "I'm exactly as bad as I claimed," he said. "You're compensating." "That is what partners do," she said. They moved to the ranch together, and the house became different. Not because Emma changed it dramatically, she was not a woman who imposed, but because a house with two people in it who intend to be there is different from a house with one. She brought her 3 trunks and her father's books, and the guitar she had never been good at, and the books went on a shelf Clark built himself, and the guitar hung on a peg by the door, and the curtains she made for the bedroom window were the particular blue-gray of the canyon walls in morning light. Clark had not realized how much he had stopped seeing the inside of his own house until he saw it through Emma's presence in it. She helped with the ranch books and found 3 years of undercharging on cattle sales that, corrected going forward, added meaningfully to their income. She learned to ride one of the horses Delgado sold her, a solid gray mare she named Margaret, and she was on Margaret by the end of March, riding the fence line with Clark in the evenings with the easy confidence of someone who has decided to be good at something and applied herself accordingly. Denny Prout, who had been borderline mutinous about the prospect of a woman on the ranch before Emma arrived, became within 3 weeks one of her most loyal partisans. The transformation happened when Emma mended his good coat without being asked and returned it to him folded neatly, with a note saying she'd noticed the sleeve seam going and thought he might like it fixed before it became a problem. Denny treated her afterward with the specific reverence of a man who has been unexpectedly and specifically noticed. Hector Vasquez simply said, when Clark asked him what he thought of the new arrangement, "Your father would have liked her very much." And then he went back to what he was doing, which was how Hector communicated that a thing was settled. The spring came on fast that year, and the ranch came alive with the particular urgency of spring on the high plains, calving season, fence repairs after the winter damage, the creek running high from mountain snowmelt. Clark worked hard and Emma worked beside him, and at night they sat on the porch that he extended to twice its previous size over the course of 3 weekends, and the stars over the territory were extraordinary, and they talked about everything and nothing in the way of people who have found in each other the specific company that makes silence and conversation equally satisfying. Emma began teaching at the school in Cimarron 2 days a week that autumn. The school had needed a reader and a grammar teacher, and Emma went into town on Tuesdays and Thursdays on Margaret, and she was, by all accounts, an excellent teacher, patient with the children who struggled, genuinely interesting to the ones who didn't, and absolutely unwilling to accept that the girl students were less capable of learning arithmetic than the boys, a position she defended with the particular quiet conviction of someone who had personal evidence on the subject. Clark rode into Cimarron more often that year than ever before, not because of his own needs, but because he liked to meet Emma at the school when she was finished and ride home with her in the late afternoon, and she seemed to like it too. She would come out of the schoolhouse and see him at the rail, and the expression on her face was the one he had decided was his favorite thing in the territory. They had their first argument in October of that year, about the bull. Clark had found a bull in the mountains that he believed had wandered from the Peralta ranch to the south, and wanted to run it back across the property line. Emma thought the better course was to send a message to Peralta first and confirm ownership, because there had been 3 bull thefts in the territory that fall, and showing up on a neighbor's land with a questionable bull was the kind of thing that could easily be misread. Clark argued his position firmly. Emma argued hers with equal firmness. It was a real argument, with raised voices and a door shut a bit harder than necessary, and Clark spent 20 minutes in the barn convincing himself that he was right before he conceded, in the privacy of his own thinking, that Emma's logic was entirely sound, and that his instinct to just handle things directly himself, without involving anyone, was an old habit and not necessarily the best one. He went back inside and said, "You're right." Emma, who was at the table not reading the book she was holding, looked up. "I know it," she said, "but I appreciate you saying it." "Send the message," he said, "and I'll keep the bull in the south pen until we hear back." "Good." They were quiet. "I don't like arguing with you," he said. "I know," she said. "I don't like it either, but I think sometimes we'll disagree, and I would rather we argue honestly and work it out than pretend we never do." "That's reasonable," he said. She set down her book. "Come and sit with me." He came and sat with her. Peralta sent a message back 2 days later confirming that the bull was indeed his and thanking them warmly, and he came himself to collect it and stayed for supper. And the whole thing ended with a neighboring relation considerably more solid than it had been before, which was exactly what Emma had predicted. Clark accepted this outcome with the grace of a man who is trying to learn something new. Their son was born in the summer of 1884, on the 6th of July, which James Turner said was the most patriotic thing he had ever heard of, though Emma pointed out that she had had very little scheduling authority in the matter. He was a healthy, loud child with Clark's dark hair and Emma's brown eyes, and a pair of fists that he waved with tremendous conviction, and they named him Thomas, without deliberation, because there was only ever going to be one name. Clark held his son in the cabin on the morning of his birth and stood at the window with him, with the canyon lit up in the summer morning light outside. And he understood, standing there, the full geography of what had happened to him, how far he had traveled from the man who had stood at a different grave and promised himself the world would never again be allowed to matter. Thomas Graves, his father, had said the land only meant something if you shared it. Clark Graves, his son's father, looked at his wife sleeping in the bed behind him, exhausted and peaceful and more herself than he had ever seen anyone be themselves, and looked at the child in his arms who was this entirely new fact in the world and thought, yes, he had been exactly right. He had buried his last kindness with his father. And then Emma Turner had knocked on a September afternoon in 1882 with a broken wheel and a weary horse and those steady brown eyes, and he had found astonished, almost against his will, that the kindness was not buried at all. It had been waiting, the way the land waits for rain, certain that it will come. Thomas slept on Clark's chest, small and solid and demanding as spring, and Clark stood at the window and looked at the world his father had built for him, and he loved it with a completeness he had not believed himself capable of, and he was grateful. James Turner came out to the ranch the following Sunday to meet his nephew, and brought with him a letter from their mother's sister in Missouri who said she might visit. And a bottle of excellent whiskey, he said, was for Clark, but which he also clearly intended to sample. And he held Thomas Turner Graves with the careful reverence of a new uncle who has not previously held many infants, and is determined not to drop one. And Emma watched her brother from across the room with an expression that was simply love, uncomplicated and full. Clark watched Emma watching James and thought, this is a family. The thought arrived without the old weight, without the fear of loss that had once made all attachment feel dangerous. It arrived the way sunrise arrives over the canyon rim, quietly, steadily, inevitable. Life on the ranch in the following years was not without difficulty, because life on a territory ranch was never without difficulty, but it was the honest difficulty of real things rather than the corrosive difficulty of a man waging war with his own heart. There were bad winters and good ones, lean cattle prices and better ones, a drought in the summer of 1885 that required hard decisions and good management, and the specific comfort of two people making those decisions together rather than one person bearing them alone. Emma continued to teach 2 days a week until Thomas was old enough to come with her, which he did with his father's focused expression and his mother's relentless curiosity about everything. The school got its better reader library, because Emma simply wrote letters to publishers in the East, until several of them donated books on the grounds that the persistence of the request left them no dignified alternative. Denny Prout married a woman from town named Rosario in 1885 and moved to a house on the edge of Cimarron, but he continued to work the ranch because, as he told Rosario, Clark Graves was the fairest employer in the territory, and he was not about to give that up. Rosario visited the ranch frequently and became one of Emma's closer friends, the two of them sitting on the extended porch in the afternoons with Thomas between them, and talking with the particular quality of women who understand each other's intelligence and find it mutually refreshing. Hector Vasquez stayed on the ranch until he was 65, and then retired with a pension that Clark had put aside quietly for years, and he went to live with his daughter's family in Santa Fe, and sent letters occasionally that Clark read aloud at dinner, and that were full of Hector's characteristic compressed wisdom. He had stayed long enough to see Thomas Graves take his first steps on the porch of the ranch house, and he had said, that evening, "Your father would have been very happy." Right down to his bones, Clark had said nothing for a moment, then, "I know." The second child was a girl, born in the spring of 1887, and they named her Catherine for Emma's mother, and she arrived in the world with an imperative quality that immediately distinguished her from her quieter older brother. Catherine Graves was, from approximately 6 weeks of age, the organizing intelligence of any room she was in, which Emma observed with the particular equanimity of a woman who recognized the trait. Thomas adored his sister with the complete and slightly bewildered devotion of a 3-year-old, confronted with a new and inexplicable fact of his universe. He sat next to her crib and watched her with enormous dark eyes, and when she cried, He would come find whichever parent was closest with an urgent need to report the situation, as if he suspected they might not have noticed. "He is going to spend his whole life looking after her," Emma said one evening, watching this. "Or she'll spend her whole life telling him what to do," Clark said. Emma smiled. "Why not both?" Clark sat down beside her on the porch, and she leaned against him naturally, the way she had come to over these years, fitting against his side the way a thing fits when it was always supposed to be there. The evening was warm and the canyon was turning purple and the cattle were moving at the south fence, and Thomas was inside with Catherine, performing his sentinel duty with complete seriousness. "Are you happy?" Emma asked. He looked at the question as he looked at most real questions, directly and without deflection. He thought about the man he had been in November of 1879, standing at his father's grave making promises to himself about distance and self-containment. He thought about the man he had been in September of 1882, on the verge of telling a woman with a broken wagon to wait for someone else to help her. "Yes," he said, not casually, deliberately, with the full weight of a man who has come far enough to understand the distance. Emma tilted her head up and looked at him. "I am extremely happy," he amended, because it deserved the larger word. She smiled and settled back against him, and they watched the evening come over the canyon together. The years settled into themselves the way good years do, not without event, not without the ordinary grief and strain and unexpected joy of a lived life, but with the particular texture of a life that is being lived fully and honestly and in good company. Clark added to the cabin twice, until it was a proper house with 4 rooms and a real kitchen, and a study where Emma kept her father's books and her school materials, and the ledgers she still maintained for the ranch, and occasionally for neighboring ranches when the owners were in the kind of trouble that honest bookkeeping could actually solve. The extended porch wrapped around the south and west faces of the house, and in the evenings year-round, Clark and Emma walked the fence line as Thomas Graves and his son had once done, and talked about the land and the children and the cattle and the world beyond the canyon rim, and the conversations were never small, because Emma Turner had always asked real questions and Clark Graves had, over the years, learned to give real answers. Thomas grew into a boy who was thoughtful and capable, and who had his grandfather's quality of showing up, quiet and reliable, exactly when he was needed. He rode with his father by the time he was 7, learning the land with the serious attention of a child who understands that something real is being passed to him. Clark taught him to read fences and read weather and read the behavior of cattle, and Emma taught him to read everything else, and between the two of them, Thomas Graves was growing into someone his great-grandfather would have recognized and approved of. Catherine was the one who charmed everyone in the territory. She had her mother's directness and her father's gray eyes and an absolute refusal to be told. She could not do something on the grounds of being a girl, which Emma encouraged with transparent pride, and Clark supported with the specific conviction of a man who has watched his wife run a ranch's books and teach arithmetic to children and make better decisions than most men he knew. James Turner remained in Cimarron, running the mercantile with increasing success, and eventually taking on a partner named Whitfield who was excellent at the actual merchandising portion of the business, and left James free to do what he was genuinely best at, which was knowing everyone and connecting people with what they needed. James never married, though not from lack of interest or opportunity. He simply seemed to find his fullest satisfaction in the web of connections he maintained across the territory, and in being the best possible uncle to Thomas and Catherine, a role he filled with lavish and enthusiastic dedication that the children accepted as their rightful due. On a warm evening in the spring of 1890, Clark Graves sat on the porch of the house his father had begun and he had finished, and he looked out at the land his father had registered, and he had kept and was now, in the particular ongoing way of inherited things, handing forward to his children. Thomas was at the barn, doing the evening feeding with the thoroughness of a 9-year-old who has decided that thoroughness is the measure of character. Catherine was inside with Emma, loudly and incorrectly playing the guitar that had hung on the peg by the door for 8 years, and which she had recently decided she was going to master through determination alone. The sounds of the ranch in the evening, the cattle, the horses, the wind in the canyon, the sound of his daughter wrestling a cord into submission, and his son talking to the horses while he fed them, his wife's voice inside responding to Catherine's question about finger placement, were the specific and irreplaceable sounds of a life that was real and whole and fully inhabited. Clark Graves sat in the evening light and felt the thing that had been sealed for 3 years, and then opened by a woman with a broken wagon and steady brown eyes. And the thing was not sealed anymore, and would never be sealed again. And it was love, large, ordinary, daily, permanent love. And it was the most significant fact of his existence. Emma came out through the door and sat beside him and handed him a cup of coffee, because she knew he liked one in the evening, and she had learned to have it ready before he knew he wanted it. The way a person learns the rhythms of someone they have lived alongside long enough to know them whole. He looked at the cup and then at her. "Thank you," he said. She settled back in her chair and looked at the canyon where the last of the day was turning the rock from red to purple. "Thomas is going to want to talk to you about that broken rail on the east fence," she said. "He found it today and I think he's been waiting to report it to you in person." "I know. I saw it yesterday. I left it for him to find." Emma turned and looked at him. "He needs to practice bringing problems forward," Clark said, "not just solving them alone." Emma studied her husband with the warm, precise attention she had brought to everything from the beginning, and she smiled. "That is," she said, "a very wise approach." "I learned from someone," he said. "Did you?" "My father taught me the land," Clark said. "You taught me the rest." Emma reached over and took his hand, the way she had taken it that afternoon on the fence line years ago, certain and warm and entirely present. The canyon below held its evening quiet. Thomas's voice carried from the barn, talking to the horses in the low, reassuring tone he had inherited from his father without knowing it. Catherine's guitar produced something that was almost recognizably a melody. The stars were beginning to appear over the eastern rim. Clark Graves sat with his wife's hand in his and the evening all around him, and the weight of a full life in his chest where 3 years of sealed and silent nothing had once lived. And he was grateful gratitude being, as he had discovered, the thing that kindness ultimately becomes when it is properly housed and properly tended. He had buried his last kindness with his father, or so he had believed. She had knocked. He had found he had not. And all the rest, the ranch, the children, the evening walks, the 2 cups of coffee in the morning before the day began, the fence lines in the canyon, and the years of honest, chosen, daily love, all of it had grown from that one discovery, the way everything real grows from the moment a person decides to stop being sealed and starts being open. Thomas came out of the barn and crossed the yard in the last of the light and came up onto the porch and said, "Papa, there is a rail broken on the east fence." "I thought you should know." Clark looked at his son. "Good catch," he said. "We'll fix it in the morning." Thomas nodded with the satisfaction of a mission properly completed and went inside. And the sound of Catherine's guitar and her brother's voice joined together inside the house, and Emma's hand tightened slightly in Clark's, and the territory night came on full and star-heavy and wide. The same sky that had hung above his father's ranch and above the grave and above every hard morning and good evening of Clark's life, unchanged by any of it, holding all of it, patient and permanent as stone. Clark looked up at that sky and was, without reservation or qualification or the old familiar fear, entirely glad to be alive in it.